The cousins called it a coffin for forgotten dreams, but Alara knew her father's dented steamer trunk was the only thing he'd left her that truly mattered. What she didn't know was that hidden inside a false lining, a secret compartment held bearer bonds and antique securities worth $312 million. Before we uncover the impossible truth locked inside, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. And let us know in the comments where you were watching from me. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, back to the silence of that dusty attic. The air in her father's small, rented house was thick with the scent of old paper and dust, a smell she had always associated with him. It was a smell of comfort, of quiet afternoons spent reading while he scribbled in his notebooks. But today it felt suffocating, a physical manifestation of grief. The funeral had been a sparse affair, attended by a handful of his former colleagues from the university, a few neighbors, and her cousins, Mark and Sarah, who had made the trip with an air of reluctant duty. They stood in the living room now, their expensive shoes looking conspicuously clean on the worn floorboards, their voices a low, impatient murmur. They were picking through the remnants of Professor Alistair Finch's life with the detached efficiency of estate liquidators, sorting his meager possessions into two piles, worthless and utterly worthless. Alara watched them from the doorway, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn coat. She felt like a ghost in her own memory, an observer of a life being dismantled piece by piece. Mark, a man whose success was measured in sharp suits and sharper investments, held up a chipped ceramic mug. University History Department, 1998, he read, a smirk playing on his lips. I'm sure the Historical Society will be clamoring for this artifact. Sarah laughed, a sound as brittle as the dried flowers on the mantelpiece. Honestly, Alara, how did you let him live like this? It's just sad. Alara didn't answer. She knew what they saw. They saw a failed academic who had published one moderately respected book 20 years ago and then faded into obscurity, a man who chose dusty tomes over stock portfolios. They saw mismatched furniture, threadbare rugs, and shelves overflowing with books that were probably worth less than the wood they were printed on. They didn't see the late-night discussions about Roman aqueducts, the shared cups of tea while a storm raged outside, the quiet, unwavering love that had been the foundation of her entire world. Her gaze drifted to the corner of the room, to the old steamer trunk. It was massive, made of dark oilcloth-covered wood, bound with brass fittings that had long ago tarnished to a murky green. Its surface was a geography of a life lived, dense from baggage handlers and forgotten train stations, scratches from narrow doorways in foreign countries, a faded shipping label from a port she couldn't quite read. To Mark and Sarah, it was junk, a final, cumbersome piece of evidence of their uncle's impracticality. Mark asked, gesturing to it with a dismissive wave of his hand. Quote under quote 5. Alara said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through their derision. They both turned to look at her, their expressions a mixture of pity and disbelief. Quote 10, Sarah echoed. Quote 7. The insult was casual, effortless, and it landed with the precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Alara's apartment was small, a third-floor walk-up, where the rent consumed nearly half of her librarian's salary. The trunk would indeed dominate the tiny living space, a constant, hulking reminder of everything she had lost and everything she lacked. But it was his. It had sat at the foot of his bed for as long as she could remember. It was the one object that felt intrinsically connected to him, a vessel for his quiet, uncelebrated life. I want it, she repeated, her jaw tightening. It's the only thing I want. Mark sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the foolishness of others. Fine. Whatever you want, Alara. We'll have the movers drop it off. Just don't come asking us for money for a chiropractor when you throw your back out trying to move it. They left soon after, their sleek German car whispering away from the curb, leaving Alara alone in the profound silence of the house. The movers came the next day, two bored-looking men who grunted and swore, as they maneuvered the heavy trunk down the narrow hallway and into her apartment. They placed it against the largest wall in her living room, where it immediately seemed to suck all the light and space from the room. For weeks, it sat there, a silent, reproachful monolith. She dusted its scarred surface, ran her fingers over the cold brass latch, but she couldn't bring herself to open it. Opening it felt like a final act of acceptance, an admission that the stories he might have told her about its contents were gone forever. The pressure of her life, however, did not wait for her grief to subside. A final notice, its red lettering like a splash of blood on the stack of mail, announced that her rent was critically overdue. The library had cut back her hours. Her student loans were a relentless, crushing weight. She sat on her sofa, the notice trembling in her hand, and looked at the trunk. The cousin's words echoed in her mind. A coffin for forgotten dreams. Maybe they were right. It was just a box, and inside were just things. Things that couldn't pay her rent or fix the leaking faucet in her kitchen. With a surge of resentful energy, she stood up. She would empty it. She would clean it. She would sell it. Maybe she could get $100 for it. Enough to buy some time. Enough to breathe for another week. The latches were stiff, groaning in protest as she forced them open. The lid was heavy, and as she lifted it, the scent of cedar and old linen filled the room, a ghostly perfume of the past. The contents were exactly as she'd expected. Neat stacks of his academic papers tied with string, a collection of geological survey maps from his travels, his favorite tweed jacket, which still faintly smelled of him, a box of photographs, faded and curling at the edges. She worked methodically, her initial desperation hardening into a grim resolve. She created piles on the floor, sorting his life into categories, just as the cousins had. It felt like a betrayal. Each item she removed felt like she was erasing a piece of him. Finally, the trunk was empty, a hollow cavity lined with faded, floral-patterned silk. She ran her hand along the bottom, intending to wipe away the last of the dust before taking pictures for the online listing. That's when she felt it. A slight give, a subtle irregularity in the fabric. Her fingers traced the seam along the edge. It was perfect, almost invisible, but in one corner a single thread had come loose. It was an anomaly, a tiny flaw in the otherwise meticulous lining. Curiosity, the first emotion other than grief or anxiety she had felt in weeks, pricked at her. She pulled at the thread. It came away easily, and as it did, the seam puckered. She worked her fingernails into the tiny gap and pulled. The entire bottom panel, a false floor of thin wood wrapped in silk, lifted with a soft sigh of displaced air. Beneath it was not the rough wood of the trunk's true bottom, but a recessed compartment, dark and deep. And it was not empty. It was filled to the brim with stacks of documents, wrapped in oilskin and tied with leather straps. They were thick, heavy bundles. Her first thought was that they were more of his research, perhaps a hidden manuscript. But as she lifted the first bundle, she saw the engraving on the top document. It was ornate, official, and the words were stark. Bearer bond. She didn't understand. She lifted another, and another. They were all the same. Bonds, stock certificates, deeds, antique documents, printed on heavy, creamy paper that felt impossibly valuable to the touch. Tucked into the side of the compartment was a small, leather-bound ledger and a single sealed envelope. Her hands shaking, she opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded crisply. The handwriting was her father's, the familiar, elegant script that she knew so well. It was not a letter, it was a statement, a command. It read, her heart hammered against her ribs. It didn't make sense. Her father was a humble professor. He struggled with bills just like she did. This was impossible. She opened the ledger. The first page contained a neat, columnar list of the compartment's contents, with dates and alphanumeric codes. The last page contained a summary, a final tally calculated in her father's hand, dated just 6 months before his death. She read the number once, then twice, certain her eyes were deceiving her. That grief was making her hallucinate. But the ink was clear, the figures precise. The estimated value of the contents, based on holdings in antiquarian securities, foundational shares in long-forgotten companies, and matured government bonds, was $312 million. The room tilted. The air grew thin. Alara sank to the floor, her back against the cold, unyielding side of the trunk. The red-lettered final notice lay on the coffee table, a relic from a world that had ceased to exist just moments before. $312 million. The number was an absurdity. It was a weight far heavier than the trunk itself, a crushing, terrifying, incomprehensible weight. And it was not an inheritance. It was a responsibility. The word echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of her tiny apartment, a silence filled not with peace, but with the terrifying gravity of an impossible secret. The shock did not recede. It was a physical presence in the room, a low hum beneath the surface of reality. For hours, Alara simply sat on the floor, the ledger open in her lap, the cryptic note resting beside it. The bearer bonds and certificates remained in their neat stacks inside the trunk's hidden belly, an impossible treasure radiating a strange, almost menacing energy. $312 million. The phrase repeated in her mind, a nonsensical mantra. It was a number so vast it had no anchor in her world, a world defined by overdue bills, instant noodle dinners, and the constant gnawing anxiety of financial precarity. She tried to connect this staggering sum to the man she knew, the father who wore sweaters with patched elbows, who drove a 15-year-old car that rattled on the highway, who considered a trip to the used bookstore the height of extravagance. It was impossible. Alistair Finch had been a man of modest means and even more modest tastes. He had valued knowledge above all else, ideas over assets. The existence of this fortune was a fundamental contradiction of the man she had loved and mourned. Was it a mistake? A cruel, elaborate joke? She picked up one of the bonds, its paper thick and fibrous. The United States of America, $10,000, payable to bearer. The date was 1934. It felt real. The engraving was sharp, the ink deep and unfaded. It felt ancient and powerful, a sleeping dragon in the palm of her hand. The weight of the responsibility, as his note had called it, began to settle upon her. This wasn't a lottery ticket. It wasn't a sudden, clean windfall. The note, the secrecy, the sheer strangeness of it all suggested something far more complex, something laden with history and expectation. Her father had not left her a fortune. He had left her a burden of immense proportions. The sun began to set, casting long, distorted shadows across her small living room. The trunk, now open and exposed, looked like a gaping maw, a portal to a world she was not equipped to enter. Fear, cold and sharp, began to pierce through the fog of her shock. Who knew about this? Where had it come from? What was she supposed to do? Her first instinct was to tell someone, to share the impossible weight. But who? The cousins? Mark's condescending smirk and Sarah's brittle laugh flashed in her mind. They would descend like vultures, their greed insatiable. They would tear it all apart legally, emotionally, until nothing was left but bitterness and legal fees. They had seen a worthless man, a failed academic. They were not worthy of his secret. Friends? She had a few, but how could she explain this? How could she bridge the chasm that had just opened between her life and theirs? The money would change everything, poison every interaction, breed resentment and suspicion. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. Her gaze fell upon the telephone. There was one person, perhaps the only person, who might understand. Not the money part, but the part about secrets and legacy and the weight of the past. Mr. Abernathy. He lived in the apartment directly below hers. A retired clockmaker in his late 80s, he was a man who moved at a different pace from the rest of the world. He was quiet, meticulous, and saw life in terms of gears and springs, of patient, intricate mechanisms. He had been kind to her father, sharing conversations about history and craftsmanship over the fence in their small community garden. He had been kind to her, always offering a gentle smile and asking after her well-being since her father's passing. It was a risk, a monumental one, but the silence in her apartment was becoming unbearable. She needed an anchor, a calm voice in the storm that was raging inside her head. Taking a deep breath, she picked up the ledger and the single note, leaving the bonds hidden within the trunk. She closed the lid, the heavy wood settling with a definitive thud, and walked out of her apartment. The hallway felt strangely long, each step an echo of her thudding heart. She knocked on his door, the sound unnaturally loud. He opened it a moment later, a small, stooped man with kind eyes magnified by thick spectacles. He was holding a tiny brass gear with a pair of tweezers. Quote 13, he said, his voice soft and raspy, like the ticking of an old clock. Quote 14. She couldn't speak. She simply held out the ledger and the note. He looked at her face, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to gentle concern. He took the items from her trembling hand and gestured for her to come inside. His apartment was the antithesis of hers. Where hers was sparse and modern, his was a museum of time. Grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels in the corners, their pendulums still. The walls were covered in shelves holding clock faces, gears, springs, and delicate tools. The air smelled of oil and old wood. He led her to a worn armchair and then sat opposite her, placing the ledger and note on a small table between them. He put on a second pair of reading glasses over his first and read the note, his lips moving silently. Then he opened the ledger and began to scan the first page. He was silent for a very long time. The only sound in the room was the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a single mantel clock, a sound that seemed to measure the passing of one reality into the next. Alara watched his face, searching for a reaction. There was no shock, no disbelief. Instead, his brow furrowed in deep, intense concentration, as if he were examining the intricate workings of a particularly complex timepiece. Finally, he looked up, his gaze meeting hers over the top of his glasses. "Your father," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "was a more complicated man than many people knew." He tapped a long, delicate finger on the note. He chose his words carefully. Responsibility? Not gift. Not fortune. This word is the key, Alara. Oh, it is the mainspring of this entire mechanism. He then turned his attention to the ledger, his finger tracing one of the lines. Bearer bonds of this vintage are difficult. They are anonymous, like cash, but moving them, authenticating them, converting them, that is not a simple task. It attracts attention, unwanted attention. The way he said it sent a chill down her spine. He was not talking about taxes or government agencies. He was talking about something else, something more predatory. Suddenly, the phone in her pocket buzzed, the harsh sound violating the quiet sanctuary of his apartment. She pulled it out. The caller ID read Mark, her cousin. A wave of nausea washed over her. It felt like an intrusion, a contamination of the secret she was desperately trying to protect. She ignored the call, silencing the phone and placing it face down on the table. Abernathy noted the action with a slight nod. "The world will feel it," he said, as if reading her mind. "A fortune of this magnitude has a kind of gravity. It pulls things toward it. People, greed, danger. You must be silent. You must be patient. You must be invisible." He closed the ledger and pushed it gently back toward her, along with the note. "This secret is yours now. You must treat it not as money but as a puzzle. Your father has left you the pieces, the ledger, the note. I suspect there are other pieces you have not yet found. The first step is not to act, but to understand, to listen to what your father is trying to tell you from across the silence." He looked at the note again. "A responsibility to whom? For what? That is the question you must answer, and you must answer it before you touch a single dollar." His words were calm, measured, but they carried an immense weight. He had given her not solutions, but a framework, a way to think about the unthinkable. He had validated her fear, but also given her a sliver of purpose. This wasn't just about hiding money. It was about deciphering a legacy. As she stood to leave, her legs still unsteady, he placed a gentle hand on her arm. 223. She walked back to her apartment, the weight in her chest feeling slightly different. It was no longer just the crushing burden of a terrifying secret, but the heavy mantle of a profound and mysterious duty. Back in her apartment, she locked the door and slid the chain across. The blinking light on her phone indicated a voicemail from Mark. She listened to it, his voice oozing with false sympathy. 24. The condescension was a physical thing, a bitter taste in her mouth, a couple thousand, alone. He was offering her a bucket of water while she was drowning in an ocean he couldn't even conceive of. The offer, meant to indebt her and reinforce her status as the family failure, had the opposite effect. It solidified her resolve. Mr. Abernathy was right. Silence, patience, invisibility. She would not be the frightened, indebted girl her cousin saw. She would be the guardian of her father's secret. She opened the trunk again, this time with a sense of purpose. She carefully lifted out the stacks of bonds and set them aside. Beneath them, tucked into a corner, were several of her father's journals, one she hadn't seen before. They were bound in simple black leather, filled with his dense academic script, and beside them, nestled in a velvet pouch, was a single, heavy, ornate key. It was unlike any key she had ever seen, its design intricate and archaic. It was another piece of the puzzle. She sat on the floor, opened the first journal, and began to read. The world outside, with its final notices and patronizing cousins, faded away. She was stepping into her father's real legacy, a story far deeper and more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The journals were not personal diaries. They were meticulous, scholarly records, a secret history running parallel to the quiet academic life the world had seen. Alara read late into the night, the only light in her apartment coming from a single lamp that cast a golden pool around her, making the rest of the room feel like an encroaching wilderness. The script was dense, filled with historical references, philosophical musings, and coded language she struggled to decipher. But as she read, a narrative began to emerge, one that was both fantastic and terrifyingly real. Her father, Alistair Finch, had not been just a history professor. He was the latest in a long line of curators for something called the Silent Trust. The trust was not a legal entity, not a corporation or a foundation that existed on any official register. It was a covenant, a secret lineage of guardians stretching back to the late 19th century. It began with a man named Silas Mercer, a reclusive inventor and industrialist who had amassed a colossal fortune through patents in early electrical engineering and telegraphy. Mercer, according to her father's journals, was a visionary haunted by the rapacious greed of his era. The robber barons, the corrupt politicians, the burgeoning military-industrial complex. He feared his wealth, if left to the world, would be co-opted to build weapons, to consolidate power, to crush the human spirit rather than elevate it. So he had converted his fortune into its most anonymous and durable forms: bearer bonds, precious metals, shares in foundational companies held through proxies, and strategically purchased, unassuming parcels of land. He then entrusted it not to a board of directors, but to a single individual, a curator, whose sole duty was to preserve the principle and use its interest, its whispers, as the journal called it, to quietly and anonymously nurture the things Mercer valued: knowledge, art, and independent thought. The wealth was a tool, a shield, a silent counterforce against the rising tide of institutional power and ignorance. The journal entry detailing this was chilling in its clarity. The trust is an antibody in the bloodstream of history. It does not seek to cure the disease of human greed, for that is impossible. It seeks only to protect the vital organs: the libraries, the museums, the schools of true philosophy, the lone artists and thinkers, so that civilization might survive the fevers that will inevitably rack it. Her father had inherited the role from his own mentor, a reclusive archivist at the university, and his mentor from a librarian before him. The lineage was one of scholars, archivists, and quiet observers, people who understood the value of preservation over profit. The steamer trunk was the vessel, passed from one curator to the next, containing not only the core assets, but the history of the trust itself. Alara felt a wave of vertigo. Her father's life suddenly snapped into focus. His shabby clothes, his old car, his refusal to engage in the petty academic politics that might have advanced his career. It wasn't failure, it was a disguise. It was the deliberate, disciplined life of a guardian living in the shadows, his true work hidden from a world that would never understand it. The trips he took, which she had assumed were for obscure research, were documented in the journals as missions for the trust, a quiet purchase of a rare manuscript to donate it anonymously to a struggling archive in Florence, the funding of a legal challenge to prevent a historic building from being demolished in Prague, the establishment of a small, unpublicized grant for promising young poets. He had been living a double life, a life of immense power and profound secrecy, and now it was hers. The realization was not empowering, it was terrifying. She was a librarian. She organized books. She helped people find information. She was not a clandestine financier, not a guardian of history's secret treasury. She felt like a child who had been handed the controls to a complex and dangerous machine. The note made sense now. Quote to 30, Mom. It was the creed of the curator. The money was not hers to spend. She was merely its steward. The thought brought a strange sense of relief, followed immediately by a fresh wave of anxiety. If the money wasn't for her, then her own problems, the rent, the loans, were still very much real. The temptation was a low, insidious whisper in the back of her mind. A single bond. Just one. $10,000. It would solve everything. It would be a drop of water from an ocean. No one would ever know. She pushed the thought away, disgusted with herself. To do so would be to betray the entire principle of the trust, to break a chain of stewardship that had lasted for over a century. It would be to prove herself unworthy of the one thing her father had truly left her, his trust. She turned her attention to the key. It was heavy in her palm, made of a dark, non-tarnishing metal. The head was shaped like a compass rose, and the bit was a complex series of interlocking wards unlike anything she had seen. Her father's journal mentioned it only once, in a cryptic passage. The Mercer key does not open a door to a room, but a path to a resource. It must be used only when the vessel is in jeopardy or the creator's work requires a foundation of its own. What did that mean? A resource? A foundation? The puzzle was growing deeper, its pieces multiplying. Over the next few days, Alara lived in a state of suspended animation. She went to work at the library, shelving books and answering questions. The mundane reality of her job, a bizarre counterpoint to the secret life that was unfolding in her apartment. She felt disconnected, as if she were watching herself from a great distance. Every conversation was fraught with the weight of what she couldn't say. Every dollar she counted in the cash register felt like a joke. At night, she would pore over the journals, absorbing the history of the trust, trying to understand the mind of her father and the curators before him. She learned of their successes and their failures, of close calls where the trust was almost exposed, of internal debates over the ethics of their silent interventions. It was a staggering education in power, secrecy, and moral philosophy. The call from her cousin Mark came again, this time more insistent. She let it go to voicemail. Quote to 32, his message said, the false concern now frayed with irritation. Quote 33, debts. The word hung in the air. Her father had debts. Of course he did. He lived on a professor's salary. This created a new complication. If she didn't use the trust's money, how would she settle his estate? The cousins would use it as leverage, as further proof of his failure. They would pick apart his name, his memory. The pressure was building, a slow, tightening clamp. She felt trapped between two worlds, the world of her own crushing poverty and the world of a staggering, untouchable fortune. She was the poorest rich woman on the planet. One evening, driven by a need for some semblance of control, she decided to take a small, calculated risk. She had to know if the bonds were real, if this wasn't all some elaborate, cruel fantasy. She chose one of the smaller denomination bonds from a different series than the others, one that looked less significant. She researched specialized financial institutions, places that dealt with antiquarian securities, far from the commercial banks where she would be asked too many questions. She found a discreet, private firm in the city's old financial district, a place with a nameplate of polished brass and a door of heavy oak. Making the appointment over the phone was nerve-wracking. She gave a vague explanation, saying she had found some old family documents she needed appraised. The man on the other end of the line was polite, professional, and utterly emotionless. The day of the appointment, she dressed in her most professional clothes, which still felt inadequate. She carried the single bond in a stiff portfolio, her heart pounding with every step. The firm's interior was silent, carpeted, and smelled of old money and leather. It was a world away from her life. She was met by a man in a perfectly tailored suit who introduced himself as Mr. Davies. He led her to a private office, the walls lined with sober-looking financial ledgers. He didn't ask personal questions. He simply took the bond, put on a pair of white cotton gloves, and began to examine it under a magnifying lamp. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Alara could hear the blood rushing in her ears. Finally, he looked up. Quote 34, he said, his voice flat. Quote 35. He paused, his eyes calm and assessing. Quote 36. He then named a figure, the bond's current market value, including accrued interest. It was a number that could pay off her student loans and her rent for the next 5 years. Elara simply nodded, her mouth too dry to speak. Quote 30, Mr. Davies continued, sliding a business card across the polished desk. Quote, she thanked him, her voice a strained whisper, took the card and the bond, and left. She walked out of the oak door and back into the noisy sunlit street, feeling as though she had just stepped out of a different dimension. It was real, all of it. The knowledge was both a confirmation and a condemnation. The power in the trunk was real, and so was the responsibility. But her small, careful inquiry had not gone unnoticed. She didn't know it yet, but in the quiet, interconnected world of high finance, a flag had been raised. An algorithm in a distant server had noted the appearance of a long-dormant security, and that single digital ping had set in motion a chain of events that would soon bring the shadows her father had warned of directly to her door. The gravity of the fortune was beginning to pull. The confirmation that the bond was genuine did not bring peace. It brought a new, more tangible kind of fear. The abstract concept of the fortune had solidified into a concrete reality, and with it, the dangers her father had alluded to in his journals felt closer, more menacing. Elara returned the bond to its place in the trunk, feeling as though she were handling a radioactive artifact. The act of simply possessing it felt like a crime. For a week, she did nothing. She tried to lose herself in the familiar routines of her life, but the secret was a constant presence, a silent hum beneath the surface of every moment. She found herself scanning faces in the street, wondering if she was being watched. Every unexpected noise outside her apartment door made her heart leap into her throat. The world no longer felt safe. It felt like a place of hidden observers and silent threats. The first direct contact came not with a bang, but with a quiet, unnerving courtesy. It was a letter. It arrived in a heavy, cream-colored envelope, her name and address typed in a crisp, elegant font. There was no return address, only a postmark from a private courier service. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The letterhead was simple, bearing only a name and a symbol, the Meridian Group, accompanied by a logo of a stylized compass rose, eerily similar to the head of the Mercer key. The letter was brief and impeccably polite. It was from a man named Julian Sterling, who identified himself as a senior associate with the group. He wrote that his firm specialized in the recovery and management of dormant historical assets, and that their research indicated she may have come into possession of certain documents belonging to the estate of the late Silas Mercer. He requested a meeting at her earliest convenience to discuss the matter, assuring her of their utmost discretion and their desire for an amicable and mutually beneficial resolution. He provided a phone number and ended the letter with a simple, chilling phrase. "We look forward to assisting you in your newfound responsibilities." That word, responsibilities, the same word her father had used. It was not a coincidence, they knew. She didn't know how, but they knew. Was it the bank? Had Mr. Davies' firm reported the inquiry? Or was their reach far greater, their surveillance methods far more sophisticated? The Meridian Group. The name sounded benign, corporate, but the tone of the letter was anything but. It was a summons disguised as an invitation, a velvet glove hiding an iron fist. Panic seized her. Her small apartment suddenly felt like a glass cage. She reread the letter a dozen times, each word taking on a more sinister meaning. Historical assets. Amicable resolution. Assisting you. They weren't offering help. They were asserting a claim. They were the unseen forces her father's journals had warned about. The institutional powers that Silas Mercer had sought to evade. Mercer had feared that governments and corporations would twist his fortune to their own ends. And now, a century later, a corporation had come knocking. Her instinct was to run, to pack a bag and disappear. But where would she go? And what would she do with the trunk, with the silent trust? Abandoning it was unthinkable. It would be the ultimate betrayal of her father's faith in her. She thought of Mr. Abernathy. His calm, methodical mind was the only anchor she had. She took the letter downstairs, her fear a cold knot in her stomach. He read it in the same careful, deliberate way he had read her father's note, his expression unreadable. He murmured, looking at the compass, rose logo. "Protección." He looked at her over his glasses. Quote 47, she whispered. Quote mine, he said firmly. Quote, he tapped the letter. Quote 50 on. His words shifted her fear back toward purpose. She wasn't just a victim. She was a player in a game she didn't yet understand. The next few days were a blur of intense study. Mr. Abernathy, it turned out, was more than just a clockmaker. He was a self-taught historian with a deep understanding of cryptography, archival research, and the hidden pathways of information. He guided her through her father's journals, helping her see the patterns she had missed, the coded references, the subtle warnings. Together, they cross-referenced names and dates, building a clearer picture of the trust's activities and its enemies. The Meridian Group was mentioned, but only in oblique, fearful terms. Her father had referred to them as the Reclaimers, a shadowy organization that believed all significant historical artifacts and assets should be controlled by a central, quasi-corporate authority for the sake of stability. They were the antithesis of the Silent Trust's philosophy of decentralized, anonymous guardianship. The pressure from the outside world continued to mount. Her cousin Mark left another voicemail, his voice now tight with anger. The threat of legal action was terrifying. A lawyer would mean discovery, subpoenas, a public tearing apart of her father's life. The secret of the trust would never survive such scrutiny. She was being squeezed from two sides: the overt, greedy aggression of her family and the covert, sinister pressure from the Meridian Group. She felt like she was suffocating. It was during one of their late-night sessions, surrounded by books and her father's journals, that Mr. Abernathy pointed to the drawing of the Mercer key. Quote 50 Mom, he said, his finger tracing the intricate compass rose design. Quote 50 Psalm, for hours they examined the strange object. It wasn't steel or brass. It was a dark, heavy alloy that seemed to absorb the light. Mr. Abernathy, with his clockmaker's eye for detail, spotted something Alara had missed. On the shaft of the key, almost invisibly small, was a maker's mark, a tiny, stylized bird in flight. An avian mark, he breathed, his eyes wide with excitement. I know this. It belongs to a family of locksmiths and puzzle makers from the 19th century, the automaton builders. They didn't just make locks for doors, they made mechanical puzzles, cryptographic devices, safe locks that required a sequence of actions to open. This new piece of information sent them down a different path of research. They weren't looking for a door anymore. They were looking for a place, a specific complex lock that would have been commissioned from this particular artisan family. They scoured her father's journals again, searching for any mention of the artisan, of automata, of puzzle boxes. They found a reference tucked away in a passage about the preservation of old city architecture. Her father had written about a campaign he had anonymously funded years ago to save a specific building from demolition, the Blackwood Athenaeum, a private subscription library that had gone bankrupt and been abandoned for decades. He described it as a treasure house of forgotten knowledge and lamented its decay. In a margin, he had scribbled a small note. The avian's nest remains undisturbed. The Blackwood Athenaeum. The name resonated with Alara. It was a place she had passed 100 times, a grand but derelict stone building in a forgotten part of the city, its windows boarded up, its facade covered in grime. It was slated for demolition to make way for luxury condos. The project had been stalled for years due to funding issues, the same funding issues her father had likely engineered through the trust. The key was not for a bank vault, it was for something inside that library. A new sense of urgency filled them. The library was a ticking clock. If the developers secured their final funding, the building and whatever it held would be lost forever. Alara felt a surge of adrenaline. This was the first real test of her role as curator. It wasn't just about hiding, it was about acting, about protecting. She had to get inside that library. But as she prepared to investigate, another letter from the Meridian Group arrived. This one was shorter. It read, "The game was over. They had made their move, a direct public assault. The shadows were stepping into the light, and they were threatening to drag her and her father's secret out with them. The time for patience and silence was over. It was time to find what the Mercer key protected before it was too late." The threat from the Meridian Group changed the equation entirely. The slow, creeping dread that had haunted Alara was replaced by the sharp, cold urgency of a ticking clock. A legal petition meant public records, court appearances, and a full-scale assault on her privacy and her father's legacy. They were trying to force her hand, to smoke her out of her silence. She and Mr. Abernathy knew they had a rapidly closing window of opportunity before the legal machinery of Meridian pinned them down. Their only hope was to discover what the Mercer key protected and hope it gave them some form of leverage, some new resource to fight back. The Blackwood Athenaeum loomed in her mind, a hulking, silent promise. Getting inside was the first, most formidable obstacle. The building was fenced off, its doors and windows boarded shut. A sign on the chain-link fence declared it private property, warning trespassers of prosecution. A direct assault was out of the question. They needed a way in that was as quiet and discreet as the trust itself. Mr. Abernathy, using his network of fellow artisans and historical society contacts, began making inquiries. He was searching for blueprints, architectural plans, anything that might reveal a forgotten entrance or a structural weakness. Meanwhile, Alara's role was to conduct reconnaissance. She spent hours simply observing the derelict library from a coffee shop across the street, watching the patterns of the city around it. She noted the occasional security patrol, the flow of traffic, the times of day when the street was most deserted. She felt like a spy in a story she had never intended to write, her life as a librarian a distant, fading memory. The pressure from her cousins also intensified. A letter arrived from a lawyer representing Mark, a formal, jargon-laden document demanding an accounting of her father's estate. It felt like the walls were closing in from all sides, each demand a new brick in her prison. She was tempted to use the money, to throw a few $100,000 at them to make them go away, to buy her peace. But she knew it would be a mistake. It would be an admission of hidden wealth, and their greed would only grow. More importantly, it would violate the core principle of her new role. The money was not a tool for her personal convenience. She had to find another way. After days of searching, Mr. Abernathy found what they were looking for. In the dusty archives of the city's planning department, he uncovered the original 19th century plans for the Athenaeum. And on those plans, he found an anomaly, a service tunnel connecting the library's sub-basement to the city's old steam pipe network, a relic of a bygone era. The tunnel had been sealed off in the 1950s, marked on the modern city maps as defunct. But defunct did not necessarily mean impassable. It was a long shot, a dangerous one, but it was their only way in. The night they chose was moonless and cold. Alara, dressed in dark clothes, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Mr. Abernathy, too frail for such an excursion, remained in his apartment, a communications hub, with a set of walkie-talkies and a copy of the blueprints. He would be her eyes and ears, her guide through the darkness. The entrance to the steam tunnel system was a manhole in a deserted alleyway 2 blocks from the library. With a crowbar, Alara managed to pry the heavy iron lid open, the sound of grinding metal seeming to echo for miles in the silent night. The air that rose from the opening was damp and smelled of rust and decay. Armed with a powerful flashlight, the Mercer key safely in her pocket, she descended the iron ladder into the pitch blackness. The tunnel was a claustrophobic nightmare. The air was thick and cold, the dripping of water the only sound. Her flashlight beam cut a small, nervous circle in the oppressive darkness, revealing brick walls slick with moisture and massive, rust-covered pipes that snaked their way into the gloom. Following Mr. Abernathy's precise instructions crackling over the walkie-talkie, she navigated the labyrinthine network. Left at the first junction, right at the collapsed section, straight on for 200 yards. It felt like an eternity. Twice she heard the skittering of rats and her nerve almost broke. She was guided by the voice of the old clockmaker and the memory of her father's quiet courage. Finally, she reached the spot indicated on the blueprints. The tunnel opened into a small brick alcove. The wall ahead, according to the plans, should have been the foundation of the Athenaeum. It looked solid, seamless. Despair began to creep in. Had they been wrong? Then her light caught it, a faint outline, a rectangular shape in the brickwork. The mortar a slightly different shade. It was a sealed entrance. Using a small hammer and chisel from her backpack, she began to work at the mortar. The work was slow, exhausting. Every tap of the hammer sounded like a gunshot. After what felt like hours, she managed to loosen a single brick. Then another. Soon she had created a small opening. She shone her light through. The beam illuminated a vast, dark space filled with the ghostly, shrouded shapes of furniture. She was in. She painstakingly removed more bricks until the opening was just large enough to squeeze through. She emerged into the sub-basement of the Blackwood Athenaeum. The air here was different, dry and musty, thick with the scent of decaying paper. Her flashlight beam danced across furniture draped in white cloths, crates of books, and shelves that stretched up into the darkness like the ribs of a colossal skeleton. It was a tomb of knowledge, Mr. Abernathy's voice crackled over the radio, asking for a status report. She confirmed she was in, her own voice a shaky whisper. He replied, quote 65. Alara navigated the maze of the basement and found a grand, sweeping staircase, its banister thick with dust. She ascended through the silent, cavernous floors of the library. The main reading room was a breathtaking sight, even in its decay. Moonlight filtered through the grime-covered arch windows, illuminating tables and chairs where no one had sat for half a century. Dust motes danced in the pale beams like wandering spirits. It was a place of profound, heartbreaking silence. At the very top of the building, at the end of a narrow hallway, she found a single unmarked door. Unlike the others, it was made of heavy steel, and in its center was a lock. But it was no ordinary keyhole. It was a complex brass mechanism, a circular dial with intricate engravings. At its heart was a keyhole that perfectly matched the strange, complex bit of the Mercer key. Her breath caught in her throat. This was it. She took out the key, its dark metal cool and heavy in her hand. As she inserted it into the lock, she felt a series of clicks as the internal wards aligned, but turning the key did nothing. The door remained locked. She remembered Mr. Abernathy's words, quote, 66. She examined the dial. It was a compass rose, just like the head of the key. The cardinal points were marked, along with a series of what looked like constellations, her father's journals. He had often written about celestial navigation, a hobby he had shared with her. He had taught her the constellations, telling her they were humanity's oldest map. One passage from the journal flashed in her mind, one she had dismissed as philosophical rambling. The path is not straight, it follows the old stars, from the Hunter to the Twins to the Little Bear. Orion, Gemini, Ursa Minor. It was a sequence. Using the head of the key, which was designed to fit into a slot on the dial, she turned the pointer first to the constellation of Orion. A soft click echoed from within the lock, then to Gemini, another click, and finally to Ursa Minor, where the North Star Polaris was located. A loud, definitive thud resonated from the door. It was unlocked. She turned the handle and pulled. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, revealing a small, circular room. It was not an office, it was a vault, but it contained no money, no gold, no jewels. The room was lined from floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and deed boxes. In the center of the room stood a single heavy oak desk. On the desk lay a large leather-bound book, open to the first page. Alara stepped inside, her flashlight beam scanning the labels on the drawers. They bore the names of properties, trusts, and foundations. This wasn't a treasury of wealth. It was the nerve center of the silent trust. She walked to the desk and looked at the open book. It was a ledger, far more comprehensive than the one in the trunk. The first page was a mission statement, written in the elegant, looping script of Silas Mercer himself. It began. Alara finally understood. The $312 million was not the true fortune. It was liquid, operational capital. The real wealth of the silent trust was this: a vast, invisible network of properties, organizations, and legal structures, all designed to preserve knowledge and culture. The shuttered printing presses, the abandoned observatories, the small, independent archives. They were all part of this network, held through shell corporations and anonymous trusts, waiting to be activated when needed. In one of the deed boxes, she found the documents for the Blackwood Athenaeum itself. The trust owned it, holding the deed through a long-defunct historical society. They had been protecting it from demolition all along. This was the quote 70 her father's journal had mentioned. It wasn't just a room full of papers. It was a foundation. It was the infrastructure of her new responsibility. And in that moment, she also found her weapon against the Meridian Group. The archive contained detailed records of every intervention the Trust had ever made, including files on Meridian's own predatory attempts to seize historical assets. Her father had been fighting them for years, using the Trust's resources to anonymously counter their moves. He had been compiling a dossier, a history of their ruthless methods. The information in this room could expose them, challenge their legal standing, and tie them up in court for years. She was no longer just a librarian hiding a secret. She was the curator of a powerful hidden institution. The fear that had dogged her for weeks was finally replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. She had found her footing. The game had changed. Meridian thought they were hunting a frightened heiress. They had no idea they were about to confront a legacy. The discovery in the Athenaeum's hidden vault was a profound turning point for Alara. She spent hours in that secret room, the beam of her flashlight, her only companion, absorbing the scale and scope of what her father and the curators before him had built. It was a shadow kingdom dedicated to the preservation of light. The deeds, the ledgers, the dossiers, they represented 150 years of silent, determined resistance against the forces of avarice and ignorance. The weight of her responsibility did not lessen, but its nature changed. It was no longer a terrifying, abstract burden. It was a tangible mission with a history, a methodology, and a powerful hidden infrastructure. She was not alone. She was the living extension of a long, unbroken chain of guardians. Before leaving, she took several key documents: the deed to the Athenaeum itself, a summary ledger of the Trust's core holdings, and most importantly, her father's meticulously compiled dossier on the Meridian Group. She packed them carefully into her backpack, feeling the weight of their power. She sealed the vault, reversing the celestial combination, and retraced her steps through the silent, sleeping library. Squeezing back through the hole in the foundation and navigating the suffocating darkness of the steam tunnels felt different on the return journey. The fear was gone, replaced by a steely resolve. She was no longer a trespasser. She was a protector reclaiming her territory. Emerging into the pre-dawn gray of the city, she felt as though she had been reborn. The world looked the same, but her place in it had been irrevocably altered. Mr. Abernathy was waiting for her, his apartment filled with the smell of freshly brewed coffee. He listened intently as she recounted her discovery, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of awe and pride. When she showed him the dossier on Meridian, he nodded slowly. He said, his voice filled with a quiet intensity, "The next few days were a whirlwind of strategic planning. With Mr. Abernathy's guidance, Alara began to transform from a frightened librarian into a calculating strategist. They devised a multi-pronged plan. First, she needed to deal with her cousins. Their legal threats were a dangerous distraction, a vulnerability that Meridian could exploit. She couldn't reveal the truth, but she couldn't ignore them either. She decided to confront them, not with money, but with a carefully selected piece of the truth. She arranged a meeting at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop. Mark and Sarah arrived radiating an aura of aggrieved entitlement. They launched immediately into a prepared speech about their legal rights as executors, the debts of the estate, and her, quote, 73 saw behavior. Alara let them finish. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. When they were done, she simply slid a single piece of paper across the table. It was a photocopy of a page from one of her father's personal journals, not the trust journals, but one of his own diaries she had found in the trunk. The entry was from the year her own mother had passed away. In it, her father wrote of his profound grief, but also of his deep love for his family, including his niece and nephew. He wrote of his hope that they would find happiness, that they would value knowledge and kindness over material wealth, and his regret that his own academic path meant he couldn't provide for them in the way their own parents could. He wrote specifically of his pride in Mark's ambition and Sarah's spirit, even as he worried they were chasing the wrong things. The passage was raw, heartfelt, and utterly at odds with the failed, neglectful man they had constructed in their minds. They read it in silence. Sarah's expression softened, her hard facade cracking. Mark's jaw tightened, but she could see a flicker of something, shame perhaps, in his eyes. "He never said any of this to us," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "He didn't know how," Alara replied softly. "He spoke through his work, through his books. He lived in a different language, but he loved you. This estate you're so worried about, it's a few $1,000s in a bank account and a mountain of books. There are debts. I will handle them. I will use my own savings. But his memory, his name, that is not for sale. It's not to be dragged through a courtroom by lawyers who never knew him. She didn't raise her voice. Her power came from the quiet, unassailable truth of her father's words. She was offering them a choice. They could continue their greedy legal battle over a pittance, destroying the memory of the uncle who had loved them, or they could walk away and let him rest in peace. She left them sitting there, the photocopy of the journal page lying between them like a judgment. She knew it might not be a permanent solution, but it was a start. She had disarmed them for the moment, not with money, but with morality. The second front of her war was with the Meridian Group. Their legal petition had been filed. Her name was now in a public document, linked to the estate of Silas Mercer. The clock was ticking. Following Mr. Abernathy's advice, she found a lawyer. Not a high-powered corporate attorney, but a semi-retired, fiercely independent legal scholar named Evelyn Reed, a woman known for taking on impossible cases against powerful institutions. Alara met her in her cluttered, book-filled office. She didn't tell Evelyn the whole truth. She couldn't, but she told her enough. She explained that her father was a private historian who had been researching the Mercer estate and had collected documents related to it. She framed the Meridian Group as a predatory entity trying to seize her father's research and posthumously claim his work as their own, and she gave her the dossier. Evelyn Reed spent an hour reading through the file, her expression growing increasingly grim. The dossier was a damning record of Meridian's activities, hostile takeovers of small museums, leveraging legal loopholes to seize art from private collections, and pressuring academics to turn over their research. Evelyn said finally, closing the file. Evelyn agreed to take the case. Her strategy was not to fight Meridian on the grounds of ownership of the Mercer estate, which would force Alara to reveal what she had. Instead, Evelyn would file a blistering countersuit against Meridian for harassment, intellectual property theft, and tortious interference, using the evidence in the dossier as the foundation. The goal was to turn the tables, to put Meridian on the defensive and force them to defend their own questionable history in open court. It was a brilliant, asymmetric strategy. Meridian wanted a quiet, intimidating legal process to force a settlement. Evelyn was threatening to turn it into a noisy, public spectacle that would drag their entire shadowy operation into the light. While the legal battle began to take shape, Alara turned her attention to her first official act as curator. It was an idea that had been forming since she first set foot in the abandoned library. She would save the Blackwood Athenaeum. It was not just a strategic asset for the trust. It was a symbol of everything she was now fighting for. Using the detailed financial records from the vault, she and Mr. Abernathy carefully planned the maneuver. It had to be done with the absolute anonymity that was the hallmark of the silent trust. They identified a small, legitimate, but struggling historical preservation charity. Through a series of complex international bank transfers, routing funds through 3 different shell corporations established by previous curators, the trust made a substantial, anonymous donation to this charity. The donation came with a single, non-negotiable stipulation. The funds were to be used exclusively for the purchase and restoration of the Blackwood Athenaeum, to be reopened as a public library and center for archival studies. The charity, overwhelmed by the unexpected windfall, readily agreed. The news broke a week later. The city's newspapers ran a story about the miraculous last-minute salvation of the historic library by a mysterious, anonymous benefactor. The developers who had intended to demolish it were stunned. The city's cultural community was jubilant. Alara read the article in her small apartment, a quiet smile on her face. She had not spent a single dollar on herself. She had not fixed her leaking faucet or paid off her loans, but she had saved a universe of books. She had honored her father's work. It was the first time she truly felt the power she wielded, not as a burden, but as a profound and deeply satisfying privilege. She had won her first battle. The cousins had fallen silent. The legal machine was grinding away at Meridian, and a beautiful, forgotten building was about to be filled with light and life again. But she knew this was only the beginning. The Meridian Group was a powerful global entity. They would not be deterred so easily. They would fight back, and their methods would likely move from the courtroom to the shadows where they were most comfortable. The game of chess was far from over. Julian Sterling, the man from Meridian, was not someone who accepted defeat gracefully. He now knew he was not dealing with a simple, frightened heir. He was dealing with an unknown player, someone with resources, intelligence, and a deep, hidden legacy of their own. The stakes had just been raised for everyone. The public salvation of the Blackwood Athenaeum sent a clear, unspoken message to the Meridian Group. It was a demonstration of power, a move on the chessboard executed with a finesse and anonymity that signaled that they were not dealing with an amateur. Julian Sterling and his organization now understood that the inheritor of the Mercer assets, whoever she was, had access to resources and was not afraid to use them. The legal battlefront, managed by Evelyn Reed, became a war of attrition. Evelyn filed motion after motion, burying Meridian's high-priced legal team in paperwork, demanding depositions, and subpoenaing records related to the cases in her father's dossier. Her strategy was working. The focus of the case was shifting from Alara's inheritance to Meridian's predatory practices. It was a masterful defense, but it was expensive, and Alara knew that Meridian had infinitely deep pockets. They could afford to drag this out for years. The real war, she suspected, would not be fought in the courtroom. It would be fought in the shadows. A few weeks after the Athenaeum announcement, the subtle intimidation began. It started small, a black sedan, the same model, parked across the street from her apartment building for 3 days in a row. When she looked closely, she could see a figure in the driver's seat, always watching. Then her mail was tampered with, a letter from her bank arriving slit open and crudely resealed. One night, she returned from the library to find her apartment door unlocked. Nothing was taken, nothing was disturbed, but the message was clear. We can get to you anytime, anywhere. The psychological pressure was immense. The fear she had managed to conquer returned, colder and more rational this time. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about her safety. She confided in Mr. Abernathy, who grew increasingly worried. Quote 79, he said, his hands methodically cleaning a tiny clock gear, a habit that calmed him. Quote 80. But she felt alone. Mr. Abernathy was her guide and Evelyn was her champion, but she was the one living under the microscope, the one whose life was being systematically invaded. She found herself sleeping with a chair wedged under her doorknob, jumping at every creak of the floorboards. The constant stress began to wear on her. She grew thin, and dark circles appeared under her eyes. The joy of her first victory with the Athenaeum faded under the relentless, grinding pressure of the silent siege. It was during this period of intense anxiety that her cousin Sarah called her. Her tone was completely different from their last encounter. It was hesitant, almost apologetic. Sarah began. She paused. The apology was a small, unexpected crack of light in her dark world. It was a reminder that the battle wasn't just against monolithic, evil corporations. It was also about changing hearts, about honoring the truth of a good man's life. It gave her a sliver of the strength she needed to continue. The turning point in the shadow war came from an unexpected source, the past. While studying the trust's infrastructure in the Athenaeum vault one night, Alara came across a series of encrypted ledgers from the 1970s, a period when her father's mentor was the curator. Mr. Abernathy, with his knowledge of old cryptographic methods, helped her decipher them. They detailed a conflict with another predatory organization, a precursor to Meridian. The old curator had successfully fought them off, not by direct confrontation, but by acquiring a piece of damning leverage, evidence of massive financial fraud committed by the organization's founder, and then using it to force a permanent, binding non-interference agreement. The agreement was privately arbitrated and sealed, a secret treaty between two shadow organizations. The lesson was clear. Meridian would only back down if the cost of continuing their attack became greater than any potential reward. They needed to find a similar piece of leverage against Julian Sterling himself. Her father's dossier was powerful, but it was about the organization. To stop the man driving the attack, they needed something personal. The task seemed impossible. Julian Sterling was a ghost. He had no public profile, no social media presence. He was a man who lived entirely in the shadows he cultivated. But her father's dossier contained a clue, a single name mentioned in an old investigative report, a disgraced journalist named Ben Carter, who had apparently tried to write an expose on Meridian a decade ago before his career was mysteriously ruined. Finding Carter took weeks of painstaking digital detective work. Alara, using the skills she had honed as a librarian, tracked him down to a small coastal town where he was writing for a local newspaper under a different name. She debated what to do. Contacting him was a huge risk. He could be a plant, a trap set by Meridian, but she was running out of options. The surveillance was escalating, and she knew it was only a matter of time before they made a more direct move. She decided to trust her instincts, the same instincts that had led her to the false bottom of the trunk. She traveled to the coastal town, a place of wind-beaten shacks and the constant cry of gulls. She found Ben Carter in a waterfront dive bar. He was a man who looked much older than his years, his face a roadmap of disappointment and bitterness. She sat down opposite him, placed a copy of his decade-old unpublished article on the table, and said, quote, 84, Carter was suspicious, hostile even. He had been burned badly. Meridian hadn't just killed his story, they had systematically dismantled his life, planting false evidence of plagiarism and ethical breaches that had made him unemployable. He had lost everything. But as Alara spoke, not revealing her identity, but describing the harassment she was enduring, he saw a reflection of his own past. He saw a chance, not for redemption, but for revenge. He told her everything he knew. The key to Meridian, he explained, was Sterling. The organization was built around his personal ambition. And Sterling's one vulnerability, his Achilles heel, was his origin. He had built his career and his firm's reputation on a carefully constructed image of old money and unimpeachable integrity. But it was all a lie. Sterling, Carter had discovered, was the son of a notorious art forger who had vanished in the 1980s after double-crossing the wrong people. Sterling had changed his name, erased his past, and used his father's illicit fortune and knowledge of the art world's underbelly to build the Meridian Group. His entire empire was built on a foundation of fraud and deception. Exposing this wouldn't just embarrass him, it would shatter the credibility he needed to operate in the world of high-stakes art and antiquities. His clients, the ultra-wealthy who valued discretion and legitimacy above all else, would abandon him overnight. Carter had never been able to find the definitive proof to publish his story. Sterling's past was buried deep, but he gave Alara the one lead he had never been able to follow: the name of the private Swiss bank where Sterling's father had allegedly hidden the seed money for his son's future. It was a long shot based on a rumor from a source who had died years ago, but it was something. Now Alara faced the greatest moral dilemma of her curatorship. To get the proof she needed, she would have to use the immense financial power of the Silent Trust in a way it had never been used before. Not to preserve, but to attack. She would have to hire forensic accountants, private investigators, and information brokers who operated in the gray areas of international finance. She would have to become a player in the same shadowy world as her enemy. It was a profound ethical crossroads. Silas Mercer had created the trust to be a shield. Could she in good conscience turn it into a sword? She spent a long night in the Athenaeum vault, reading Mercer's own words from his original ledger. He wrote, quote, 85, quote, the message was clear. Preservation sometimes required decisive, even aggressive action. She made her choice. She was the curator now. It was her duty to protect the trust, not just its assets, but its future. She would pull the weeds. Over the next month, Alara, guided by Carter and funded by the anonymous power of the trust, mounted a sophisticated counterintelligence operation. A team of highly skilled, discreet investigators began to carefully probe the Swiss bank. They uncovered shell corporations, traced dormant accounts, and slowly, piece by piece, they reconstructed the hidden financial history of Julian Sterling's family. They found it, the proof, an old, forgotten account linked to Sterling's father containing transaction records that directly corresponded with the seed funding of Meridian's earliest ventures. The money was dirty. It was tied to the sale of forged masterpieces. It was the smoking gun. Alara now held Julian Sterling's entire life, his entire empire, in her hands. The question was what to do with it. She could leak it to the press, destroy him publicly, but that would create a chaotic, noisy spectacle that went against everything the Silent Trust stood for. Anonymity, discretion, quiet influence. She chose a different path. She arranged a meeting. The meeting was set on her terms. Not in a corporate boardroom or a lawyer's office, but in the newly restored main reading room of the Blackwood Athenaeum. The library was not yet open to the public, but the restoration was nearly complete. The scaffolding was down, the arched windows were clean, and sunlight streamed onto the polished wood floors. It was a space reborn, a testament to the quiet power she now wielded. She chose it deliberately. It was her territory, a symbol of her purpose. Julian Sterling arrived alone, precisely on time. He was exactly as she had imagined, tall, impeccably dressed, with a calm, predatory stillness about him. His gray eyes swept the magnificent room, a flicker of professional appreciation mixed with something else, the frustration of a collector who had been outbid on a prized acquisition. Ilara stood waiting for him by a large reading table in the center of the room. She was not the frightened, overwhelmed woman from the beginning of this ordeal. She was calm, centered, dressed simply but with an air of quiet authority. She was the curator. Quote 87, she said, her voice even and steady, not betraying the frantic beating of her heart. Quote on, he replied, his voice a smooth, cultured baritone. Quote down, Ilara said. She gestured to a chair opposite her. Quote down, he sat, placing a thin leather briefcase on the table. Quote ba 93, Ilara smiled, a faint, humorless expression. Quote ba knife. Sterling's mask of polite condescension slipped for a fraction of a second. A flicker of surprise, of anger, crossed his face before being replaced by a cold, watchful curiosity. Ilara reached into a simple canvas tote bag at her feet and placed a single thin file on the table between them. Quote 95, she said. Quote Bayan, his face went pale. For the first time, Julian Sterling looked not like a predator, but like cornered prey. He stared at the file as if it were a venomous snake. He did not open it. He didn't need to. He knew exactly what it was. How, he whispered, the single word a confession of his defeat. The world is full of old stories, Ilara said, echoing the lessons she had learned from her father's journals. Otut 99. The silence in the vast room was absolute. Sterling stared at her, his mind clearly racing, searching for an angle, a countermove. But there was none. She had him. She had checkmated him. He asked, his voice strained. Ilara said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. She stood up. The meeting concluded. Auto 3. She turned and walked away, leaving him sitting alone at the table in the magnificent sunlit room he had tried and failed to claim. She didn't look back. She knew she had won. The agreement arrived the next day. Signed. The legal petition was withdrawn. The black sedan disappeared from her street. The silent siege was over. A few weeks later, Ilara stood on the steps of the Blackwood Athenaeum on its grand reopening day. The mayor was giving a speech, praising the mysterious benefactor who had saved this civic treasure. The crowd was filled with happy, cheering citizens, children eager to see the inside of the magnificent building. No one knew the quiet librarian standing at the edge of the crowd was the one responsible. She saw her cousin Sarah in the audience holding her young daughter's hand. Sarah caught her eye and gave her a small, genuine smile of gratitude. The family wound was beginning to heal. Mr. Abernathy stood beside her, looking frail but immensely proud. Your father would have liked this, he said softly. He always believed a library was a promise that the future would be smarter than the past. The journey was far from over. The Meridian group was neutralized, but her father's journal spoke of other threats, other challenges. The work of the Silent Trust was endless. The immense fortune still sat in the dented steamer trunk in her apartment, a constant reminder of the weight she carried. But for the first time, it did not feel like a burden. It felt like a tool. It felt like a purpose. She was no longer Ilara Finch, the indebted librarian. She was the curator. She was the guardian of a silent, powerful legacy, a quiet protector in a noisy world. As the ceremonial ribbon was cut and the crowd surged forward into the library, Ilara remained on the steps, a faint smile on her face. She looked at the faces of the people pouring into the building. The students, the dreamers, the seekers of knowledge, and she understood. The greatest wealth was not what you own. It was what you protected for others. The dented steamer trunk was not a coffin for forgotten dreams. It was a seed bank for 1,000 future gardens, and her work had just begun. The path ahead was long and uncertain, filled with shadows and responsibilities she could not yet fathom. But as she watched the light fill the halls of the reborn library, she felt not fear, but a profound and hopeful peace. The legacy was safe. The work would continue.